Good afternoon. Welcome to our Energy Democracy Briefing. I'd like to welcome each of you and appreciate your participation in this very important dialogue. We have for you this afternoon an exciting set of subject matter experts, advocates, and practitioners in energy democracy that will really talk about this growing movement. It's both a domestic and global movement to democratize our energy sector. We will be presenting to you today the policy platform of Emerald Cities Collaborative as a partner in the Energy Democracy Project. But we have some very important guests today, and we're very honored to have both Senator Merkley and his staff, as well as Representative Nanette Barragan as guests to open up and provide some opening remarks for our briefing today. So I'd like to first introduce Matt Dornorgo, who is the Senior Legislative Analyst for Congresswoman Nanette Barragan out of California. So Matt, would you provide us some opening comments?
Thank you, Denise. And it's great to be with you all today. And I'm sorry that Representative Barragan wasn't able to join, but I am here on her behalf supporting energy democracy solutions that center communities at the heart of the clean energy revolution. We know that in addition to ensuring jobs for displaced workers, a just transition is also about ensuring that 100% clean energy doesn't lead to a handful of wealthy corporations, while the same communities of color and low-income communities that have struggled under a fossil fuel economy remain poor. A clean energy future must also mean systemic change. One bill that Congresswoman Barragan has introduced in this, working for this change is the Energy Resilient Communities Act, which invests in clean energy microgrids for critical community infrastructure in environmental justice communities. The idea is to improve resiliency for communities hit first and worst by the climate crisis while reducing dependency on fossil fuels, lowering electric bills, and creating good paying jobs. When we initially shared our bill with advocates, one of the strongest positive responses we received was a provision we had in the legislation that the Department of Energy prioritize projects where the microgrid grants are going to a project that's called a community-owned energy system. In response to the support that we received, we actually ended up expanding the definition of what that term meant to include non-traditional types of ownership, such as systems owned collectively by community members or worker-owned businesses. We also added a carve-out within that bill's authorized funds, dedicating a minimum of $150 million a year in support for community-owned energy systems. We're now pushing to get this program included in the American Jobs Infrastructure Plan. It's just one example of how Representative Barragan is actively supporting energy democracy policies, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and working with all of the panelists and organizers of this event to build a better and more just energy system from the bottom up by and for the people. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to the moderators.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you and the leadership of Representative Barragan for really embracing, understanding, and moving and advancing energy democracy. We look forward to working with you going forward. So we're going to go ahead and proceed with our briefing today. Again, let me introduce myself. I'm Denise Fairchild. I'm the National Director of Emerald Cities Collaborative. We're a nonprofit organization that work at the intersection of environment, economy, and equity. And I'm also a member of the Energy Democracy Project, and you'll hear more about who we are and our membership. And I'm going to be your facilitator today and mostly moving the conversation forward. So what are we going to do today? The purpose of today's briefing is to bring this energy democracy movement into the legislative forefront. What is it? Why is it important? Providing examples of what our frontline communities are doing to bring energy democracy into reality. And to ask you, the congressional representatives here, to help us advance this into the mainstream legislative agenda. we see that energy democracy is sprinkled through a number of bills. And we are absolutely heartened by the leadership of Senator Merkley and Representative Barragan and other congressional folks to really advance some of the elements of energy democracy. But we are clear that it's not enough. We are on the right path, but the bottom line is that we need a stronger energy infrastructure, a new physical infrastructure where we prioritize distributed energy that is more accessible and more equitable and really promotes community climate resilience. We need a new governance and management infrastructure that is really about transparency and inclusive involvement and greater public accountability. We need a new economic infrastructure that is really committed to seeing renewable energy assets is equitably shared. When we talk about the sun and the wind, we don't see people monetizing and profiting off of what is a natural resource and should be a part of the commons. We need a new social infrastructure that recognizes energy as a human right, that prioritizes environmental and health reparation of scarred BIPOC communities and honors the sovereignty of Indigenous communities. So we've submitted a policy framework for all of you that have registered. You will see our overall policy agenda. Our presenters today will represent the diversity of America, racial, ethnic, and geographic diversity, and we'll discuss with you why it matters to them. A few of our members will open up with brief remarks and will be followed by a panel of advocates who will provide more detailed information on our key proposals. So I want you to do one favor for us, and that is we will be taking out of that format, we'll have some voices and remarks, our panel, and then we'll have a question and answer session. And so we want you to put your questions and answers in the chat, and we have one of our members that will be curating those questions going forward. So before we open up with a brief remarks, I would like to welcome and accept a few comments from Senator Merkley, who has joined our briefing. Senator Merkley, thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today.
Thank you very much, Denise, and greetings to everyone participating in this discussion, looking at how we as a nation can democratize our energy economy and address the kinds of inequalities that have plagued our energy economy for generations. And a big thank you to Emerald Cities Collaborative and Energy Democracy Project for hosting this. We have an amazing panel, and I want to take a second to thank Colette for her work and let you know I'll do everything in my power to stop your community and other communities in the Gulf from continuing to be sacrificed for energy production. This is an unprecedented moment for the United States. We are in the thick already of climate chaos. And this is the moment we have to be committed to reforming and revitalizing so much of our aging and outdated infrastructure. But we're doing it at a moment of time that has seen huge leaps and advancements in clean, green, renewable methods for generating energy, along with plummeting costs. Right now, in fact, wind and solar are cheaper, the vast amount than they were a decade ago, beating out fossil fuels and even natural gas. And we've seen a shift among our legislators, our business leaders, and everyday folks in their views and desires to embrace renewable forms of energy. So this spells opportunity, an opportunity to leap forward into a future, not just of different technology, but of a different distribution of assets as we rebuild that energy economy. As we begin to work through the president's infrastructure plan, I hope you all are as excited as I am about the massive transformational potential ahead of us. But we have to help shape that plan. We have to realize the potential to move away from a corporate, centralized fossil fuel economy where frontline communities, low-income communities, communities of color, all disproportionately bear the burden of environmental health hazards, unbearable energy burdens, the risk of climate chaos, towards a decentralized energy economy that embraces the green revolution and keeps wealth in our disadvantaged and frontline communities. An energy economy that flips the current one on its head by emphasizing the public interest and social and environmental priorities over profits. That's the vision that's possible now if we act in aggressive, coordinated fashion. And that's why a forum like this is so important. We want to pursue local ownership of energy systems and energy production so that the benefits of those investments stay in the community instead of hard-earned money going out to for-profit utilities. Think of the possibility of lower energy bills that could help struggling families pay their other bills, build wealth, the enhanced community and climate resiliency that comes from decentralized community-owned energy, the jobs that come from building distributed energy resources, and jobs that go to people in our low-income communities, in our communities of color, in our frontline communities. So lots of potential benefits if we fight hard for this vision. And so as we look at Build Back Better all across our country, the fact is that energy justice can't be separated from environmental justice or climate justice. They're all interconnected. It's not just about who owns the resources or who gets it at what price. It's about the impact that we will have on our environment and our communities. And it's about how we provide for our people by being good stewards of our planet's natural resources. It's about how we work together to build a better, more just, more equitable future. And I have to say, I'm very proud that my state of Oregon is leading in many of these efforts. I'm delighted we have a wonderful representative for our state, Anissa Pemberton from the Portland Clean Energy Fund Coalition, speaking on today's panel. Back in 2018, the people of Portland decided to take on this issue of environmental justice in their city, and they put up a ballot measure, creating a municipal grant program called the Portland Clean Energy Fund. They had to collect a whole lot of signatures. And I remember going by on election night, the gathering to monitor the outcome of this ballot measure after we'd seen so many energy ballot measures fail across the country, and the mood was very somber. People were like, yeah, we know we're probably not going to win, but we tried. But the results hadn't even come in. And then the first results come in and we're leading. And by the end of the evening, it was a blowout victory. It was a 2-to-1 victory. It was 65.3% to 34.7%, almost 2-to-1. And it shows you the power of when community organizations really work together and they knock on the doors and they say, this is how it could be different for rebuilding our energy economy in our city and creating jobs for our disadvantaged communities at the same time. So I encourage everyone to look at that Portland model that I'm sure that Anissa will have a lot more to say about. It took years of work and preparation, but they really got the job done. And that program is going to now distribute about $50 million in clean energy grants to fund projects each year, primarily for low-income residents and communities of color. And on top of that, we have a community solar program in our state, which gives communities an opportunity to invest in and develop a solar project to benefit the community. A net metering law that makes it possible for anyone to generate their own electricity and reduce their bills. Well, those are a few of the initiatives. We've got to share best ideas from around the country. And I'm sure that we're going to see many other ideas from different communities. And I will be working with members of my team to take those ideas and do what I can to forge them into federal visions that we can get into the upcoming bills. We've reached out to a number of stakeholders to get their input on other kinds of state and local programs to adopt, the barriers that stand in their way, how to incentivize and encourage adoption of these kinds of decentralized energy systems in frontline communities. And so please keep reaching out to my staff to provide your ideas. We've gotten some great responses, and we're going to continue that dialogue. But the point is this: whether it's through the president's infrastructure plan or legislation that my team and I are working on in partnership with others, it's an exciting moment. It's a critical moment for the pursuit of environmental justice and energy democratization. We have the opportunity to transform our energy economy and transform the impact on the communities. Communities have been overlooked and overburdened for time immemorial. So let's seize this moment as you all are working to do, and thank you for it.
Thank you so much, Honorable Merkley. In fact, we are very pleased and look forward to your continued leadership in this space. And indeed, Portland and your state of Oregon is a leader in this arena. And what we will be hearing from today are other practitioners from around the country in urban centers and rural communities in Indigenous communities about how we can unlock the potential to transform our energy sector as well as our economy. So we look forward to working with you and your staff and as we move forward. So with that, I would like to just open up the briefing to our Energy Democracy Project members, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-facilitator, Crystal Hong, who will move us into our next agenda. I just want to remind everyone to put your questions into the chat so that we can answer them in the second half of our presentation. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you so much, Denise. Hello, everyone. So for those who don't know, the Energy Democracy Project is a collaboration of close to 40 different geographically and racially diverse organizations working to democratize the energy sector. Together in our communities, states, regions, and across the country, we are bringing justice and equity to clean energy solutions. This is already happening. And implementing that transition is not mainly a technological problem. Rather, this transition requires a struggle against powerful economic and political interests. And we're very excited to have you join us, hear from a few of many voices from the practitioners on the ground, representing the demographic, geographic snapshots from rural America, Native communities, frontline communities on the question of why energy democracy matters to them. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chris Woolery, the Residential Energy Coordinator at Mountain Association in Kentucky, to share his perspective in the rural communities. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, and thanks so much to our hosts and to everyone for joining us. I'm Chris Woolery, and energy democracy is important to me because it creates good jobs like mine. My job came directly from engagement between cooperative utilities and their stakeholders, and I was hired after losing my own job and home and business due to the housing market crash. I'm living proof that energy democracy creates the opportunities that Americans, from coal industry workers in Eastern Kentucky to the millions of us impacted by the pandemic, want and need. In my work, rural folks tell me every day they want healthy, efficient buildings, powered by affordable, reliable, sustainable energy. They want good jobs that can't be outsourced and thriving, resilient communities that offer opportunity for all. And we are creating these solutions for ourselves. But rural households spend much more of their income on energy bills than others, and many can't afford improvements. The Weatherization Assistance Program reaches less than 1% of the 30 million eligible households per year, and must be scaled up drastically to meet those needs. Meanwhile, rural electric cooperatives across America are implementing pay-as-you-save retrofit programs like ours, proving that investing in their owner members and delivering cost-effective efficiency improvements literally pays for itself, while also generating savings for the utilities. And with a default rate of less than 0.5%, PAYS programs create net cash flows, good jobs, healthier environments, and the investments are equitable and inclusive, offering energy efficiency to renters, businesses, churches, and even folks without credit. These are just two examples of how energy democracy materially improves the lives of rural Americans. We ask for your help to scale up the solutions that we're creating. And now I'll hand it over to Kim Smith, the founder of the Indigenous Goddess Gang in New Mexico, to share her perspective on the Indigenous community. Thanks.
Yate She'e Kim Smith Yanisha. I am a Dene woman, the founder of Indigenous Goddess Gang, and a citizen scientist. I am currently living in Hogback, New Mexico, which is downstream and downwind from two of the dirtiest coal-fired power plants and coal mines in the country. As a citizen scientist living in what the Nixon administration deemed as a national sacrifice zone, I have studied health impacts policy and have seen firsthand the destruction that the exploring of and extraction of fossil fuel impacts have left on Indigenous people. The decision around this national sacrifice zone was done without our people knowing, with huge impacts to our water, air, soil, and our health. In this time, at this transition, energy democracy matters more than ever. In this transition, nuclear energy is not a sustainable transition. In Diné communities in New Mexico, children are born with uranium in their bodies, and no solutions to clean up the contamination. Respecting the rights can go a long way to stop the cycles of environmental violence in our communities and build a foundation for reimagining our energy infrastructure and a more equitable and sustainable energy future. With that, I'll pass the mic to Jessica Guadalupe Tovar, the Energy Democracy Organizer for the Local Clean Energy Alliance in California. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. As an organizer, energy democracy means the community holds the solutions to our energy problems. The centralized corporate energy model robs us of safe and equitable clean energy jobs, community-based decision-making, improving our health and local wealth. These corporations literally leave us in the dark when we are struggling to make ends meet. In the work I do, we use community choice energy policies to advocate for local clean energy investments. But energy democracy is a two-way street. Our elected officials must listen and act on these calls for clean energy solutions. We need to prioritize a just transition to clean energy from the ground up. Local clean energy in our built environment, one that does not depend on old, mismanaged transmission infrastructure like that in California, that is literally burning up the state, killing people, polluting our air, and leaving many without electricity. Now is the time to bring clean power to the people. With that, I will hand it back to Denise to introduce our panelists and discuss how the numerous clean climate and energy legislative proposals being advanced can incorporate energy democracy principles and solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our powerful leaders of the Energy Democracy Project. At this point, we're going to now present to you some of our subject matter experts and advocates that are working on the ground, making energy democracy happen. Our first presenter on the panel is Colette Pichon Battle, who's with the Gulf Coast Legal Fund. No, I'm saying that wrong. Who will present our perspectives about energy democracy as a human right. Colette.
Thank you so much for that, Denise. Peace, y'all. My name is Colette Pichon Battle. I'm the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, also known sometimes as the Gulf Coast Legal Fund. We'll take that. It's an honor to be with y'all today, and my deep and sincere thanks to the representatives and to Senator Merkley for showing up today when the community called him. I just wanted to take a moment to remind folks that on this day, April 20th, across the Gulf South and the nation, we remember the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil drilling rig that killed 11 workers and resulted in a 3-month release of over 200 million gallons of heavy crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico and onto the shores of 5 Gulf South states and the country of Mexico. The Gulf South is the epicenter of the oil and gas industry, with most of our nation's oil and gas infrastructure, nearly $8 billion in assets, found in this region. Louisiana alone hosts over 125,000 miles of pipeline, nearly half of the country's refineries, and lots of its toxic pollution. The region supplies over 75% of the country's liquid fuel, and it is the nation's largest exporter of oil and gas. The Gulf South, where I'm from, and I'm talking about the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. This region plays a pivotal role in the US economy, current national defense infrastructure, and ongoing global advancement of liberty, science, social justice, and social innovation. The combined GDP of the 5 Gulf South states would constitute the 5th largest economy in the world. And we produce more than 11% of the nation's agriculture. We have one of the most productive fisheries outside of Alaska. The Gulf South should be invested in not for national sacrifice, but for global leadership. The work of transformation begins at the front lines of this climate crisis, and the Gulf South are those front lines. Today, we're reminded by the firsthand experience of the Gulf South, about the firsthand experience of the Gulf South communities with the industry and the climate disasters that come with it. We must advance the calls from the global front lines to build in resilience in the face of a new climate reality. We need long-term federal action to address the climate crisis. We need immediate, bold action that will transform our energy system from one that kills, pollutes, and creates wealth gaps to one that is sustainable, renewable, and provides basic energy needs for all. We support the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021, which will require states and localities to conduct an energy equity analysis to identify energy burdens, environmental burdens, health burdens, and poverty. The data should be used to allocate funding in a manner that would repair energy and health burdens through equitable solutions. And the Gulf South economy that has been built by enslaved labor has now transitioned into one that is fueling and advancing environmental racism. We must address this as we go forward with climate solutions. During Hurricane Harvey in 2017, millions of pounds of toxic pollutants were leaked into the air by industry. Though the production of oil and gas has decreased on the Gulf Coast, toxic chemical production is still flourishing. In addition to targeting marginalized communities, the multifaceted petrochemical industry emits excessive quantities of greenhouse gases, causing and accelerating the global climate crisis. The front lines are the Gulf South. We must start here. But we have to start with a different perspective. As we prepare and plan for a better future, we must root starting with the understanding that energy and access to energy is a human right. We're not just talking about shifting our energy system. We're talking about transforming the way we envision and build our communities. Energy as a human right is a starting point. And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Suben, who is coming in from, I don't actually know where Suben is coming in from today, from another meeting. But I'm gonna turn over to Suben Devar, Director of the Initiative of Energy Justice, to talk more about equity and clean energy standard. Suben, over to you.
Thank you, Colette. Good afternoon, everyone. My name again is Suben Devar. I'm the Director of the Initiative for Energy Justice. And you've probably heard the saying, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with only one step. But if you enter the wrong address into your GPS, you could end up getting in a whole lot of extra steps. Setting the right goal is crucial to getting to the right destination and getting there efficiently. The same is true for crafting a federal clean energy standard, which is what I want to talk about today. We've got to start with setting the right goal. And today I'll offer a framework on how to think about the goal of an equitable clean energy standard that will center equity and energy democracy based on 3 key targets. 1, a renewable energy target. 2, a community-led distributed generation target. And 3, an equitable benefits target. The basic idea of a clean energy standard for the electric sector in particular would be to require 100% clean electricity by 2035. This is an important goal overall, but it's like just knowing the neighborhood of where you're trying to get to. An overly broad clean energy standard combined with the profit incentive of investor-owned utilities could fail to prioritize specific approaches to clean energy that maximize public benefits across different sectors. So instead, an equitable approach ensures the fair distribution of the holistic benefits of the energy system, including non-energy benefits such as economic and health benefits. A clean energy standard is a critical tool for a renewables transition. However, if defined too broadly, it would likely fail to advance equity by not considering the environmental impacts of different types of generation sources, the advantages and disadvantages of centralized transmission grid versus distributed grid connected generation, and the benefits of community-led projects. First, an equitable clean energy standard should include a renewable energy target. This first target has 2 parts. 1, the standard should allow only renewable defined energy based on international definitions that focus on pollution-free, natural, and regenerative sources of energy generation, such as solar and wind. And 2, additionally, a prioritization system should incentivize generation sources with the least on-site upstream and downstream environmental impacts over energy sources that cause more pollution. This is a common sense approach. Including a renewable energy target will incentivize the energy sources with the most co-benefits, including reducing criteria air pollutants in addition to greenhouse gas emissions. It would thereby remediate health burdens on those disproportionately harmed by the existing energy system, which we know by the science is disproportionately communities of color and low-income communities. Second, an equitable clean energy standard should include a community-led distributed generation target. This target would involve local communities in a collaborative planning process, require that at least 2/3 of electricity come from distributed energy resources, and that at least 25% of energy generation is community governed through nonprofits, cooperatives, and public entities. Community-led distributed generation has the most potential to advance holistic energy benefits from the clean energy system, such as reduced costs from avoided transmission lines, but more importantly, from local jobs, wealth, health, and resilience benefits. Third, an equitable clean energy standard should include an equitable benefits target. Combining the best practices of states such as Washington and New York, a federal clean energy standard should require the equitable distribution of clean energy benefits, including a minimum of 40% of benefits targeted to marginalized communities. Enforceable accountability mechanisms should track and report on metrics of benefits every few years or every decade alongside decarbonization targets. The structure should ensure robust community outreach and engagement, including providing financial compensation for community input in federal and state rulemaking. In closing, and to reiterate, Congress should pass an equitable clean energy standard comprised of 3 key targets. 1, a renewable energy target. 2, a community-led distributed generation target. And 3, an equitable benefits target. Appreciate your time, and I look forward to your questions at the end. Next, we know we need a transformative change to shift the structures of power in our communities. So I'm glad to introduce Timothy Denherter-Thomas, the General Manager of Cooperative Energy Futures in Minnesota, who will talk about how community-owned clean energy addresses economic justice.
Thank you, Suvan, and thank you to Senator Merkley and Representative Barragan for having us and for everyone for attending. I'm Timothy Denherter-Thomas, General Manager of Cooperative Energy Futures. We're a Minnesota member-owned clean energy cooperative. We develop and own community-owned solar on urban rooftops and rural land that is available to residents at no upfront cost and with net savings each month. This enables our members, who include renters, residents of manufactured housing parks, and low-income rural residents, to cover their electric bills through clean energy. We're already offsetting the power of over 700 member households for the next 25 years and have channeled over 16 million in investment. This is just a start. We're developing new projects that will double our capacity over the next year, with more on the way. We ensure our projects are building community wealth. While we harness private investment and bank debt, we use a partnership model that ensures that the vast majority of profits are redistributed to community members. We're part of the Energy Democracy Project and work alongside dozens of similar organizations through the People's Solar Energy Fund, which supports community-based clean energy initiatives nationwide with technical assistance and non-extractive financing. We're here because we're concerned about the glaring absence of legislative attention to community-owned clean energy. Across the country, accessible and community-based approaches to clean energy development like ours are the exception, not the rule. Here in Minnesota, over 85% of community solar serves institutions, not residents. And among those serving residents, most of our competitors are using credit scores or income requirements to set eligibility, excluding the majority of low-income communities and communities of color, who often have the highest energy burdens and the most to gain. Many projects are owned by out-of-state or even international investors, and often bring in low-wage out-of-state workers rather than growing local living wage jobs. Many parts of the country face similar situations. This isn't an accident. State and federal policy has created a deeply tilted playing field that privileges large commercial energy development and away from community scale projects focused on local benefits. Right now, the structure of federal tax incentives works for large investors, but not for local communities. Federally regulated energy markets prioritize cheap bulk power rather than prioritizing the types and locations of energy generation that have the lowest system costs and the highest value for resilience and community benefit. The nation's approach to clean energy has too often assumed that bigger is better and local value is irrelevant, even given evidence to the contrary. Federal leadership must put community scale and community-owned power at the center of a just, resilient, and thriving approach to the clean energy transition. So why is community-owned power so important? First, community energy achieves significant economies of scale that lowers costs, yet it's not so large that it requires expensive new grid upgrades whose costs are typically passed on to energy users. While utility scale clean energy may be slightly cheaper to generate, it's rarely more affordable in terms of getting energy to where it's needed. Multiple recent analyses here in Minnesota suggest that developing clean energy distributed and local will be much lower cost overall than building it large and centralized. Second, it could be developed faster. Since Minnesota has opened the floodgates to community solar, local projects have rapidly overtaken utility scale solar to make up over 2/3 of the solar in our state. This is partially because there are so many places where communities can fit energy into our local landscape, and partially because larger projects take much longer to design, permit, and build. Third, when clean energy is distributed throughout a region close to where it's used, it improves reliability and resilience. This means less need for expensive backup power plants and less vulnerability to severe weather and other grid disruptions. This is especially important for low-income communities and communities of color, who often have higher vulnerability to pollution, severe weather, and other health and safety risks. Finally, community energy opens up the opportunity for local ownership and local wealth. Unlike commercial energy developers, cooperatives, nonprofits, and public entities owning clean energy projects have a direct interest in fueling small business development, local job creation, and community ownership, especially for low-income communities who need it most. This changes how people see the energy transition. It's no longer a change happening to our communities. It's an opportunity we can harness ourselves. We need federal leadership to ensure that clean energy puts people, especially low-income communities and communities of color, in the driver's seat. Here's 3 key priorities as a start. First, as part of the current infrastructure bill, extend the investment tax credit and production tax credit and revise them so that they are available as a cash grant for nonprofit, cooperative, and publicly owned projects or projects under 5 megawatts. This gives communities access to financing currently reserved for big commercial developments. Second, create incentives and financing programs to augment the technical assistance work of the Department of Energy to support community-owned clean energy for low-income communities and communities of color. And third, pass federal policy that requires states to develop community energy programs which require utilities to accept local projects to the grid using virtual net metering, which allows energy users to participate in clean energy benefits. Community power offers a future where the energy system builds wealth for our communities, not the other way around, and where people are co-creators and beneficiaries, not just bystanders. Along with dozens of other local groups, we look forward to working alongside federal leadership to make that future a reality. Thank you. And now I'd like to pass it over to Anissa Pemberton, the coordinator of the Portland Clean Energy Fund Coalition in Oregon, who will share with you how clean energy can be done in a way that advances racial justice and economic opportunity.
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you, Senator Merkley and Representative Barragan, for holding the space, and to my fellow organizers and panelists for sharing your stories and expertise. The Portland Clean Energy Fund Coalition began in 2016 to push an innovative ballot measure that would flip the script on traditional environmentalism by leading with racial justice and economic opportunity. With 65% of voter support, the ballot measure was the Oregon's first ever environmental measure created and led by communities of color. The ballot measure created a City of Portland grant program that annually funds $44 to $61 million of clean energy projects, job training opportunities, and green infrastructure development through a 1% surcharge on large retailers whose annual sales are over $1 billion nationally, and over $500,000 in the city of Portland. Recently, the Portland City Council approved the first round of $8.6 million of grants to support low-income communities, with $60 million to be distributed over the next year. This is not just an investment in the environmental health of our communities, but in the economic health. For example, a local organization, Constructing Hope, received a $500,000 grant to create clean energy, living wage job training opportunities, and advancement services to 200 low-income community members. The US Congress should integrate allocations for locally administered clean energy funds into the upcoming infrastructure legislation, as well as the Clean Energy Futures Act. I am particularly excited about the opportunity for rural Americans to benefit from funds like these. I grew up in a small town of 5,000 people in Houston, Illinois. My hometown had a horrible smell that came from factories, industrial agriculture, and more recently, a tire fire. As I've aged, my hometown has suffered economically as jobs have disappeared. Young people like myself realized that the town had little potential for a stable career. And so we moved in order to find good jobs, only to be met with high cost of living in cities. My parents are lifelong Republicans, and we share similar concerns and values when it comes to local economic development that empowers small towns to make decisions for their own communities. According to the reports from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, energy burdens are higher for communities of color, rural communities, and low-income communities. Energy burden is one indicator to measure energy insecurity, and high energy burdens are associated with inadequate housing conditions and have been found to affect local economic development. Additionally, the same reports on rural America have shown that rural and low-income communities experience the highest median energy burden, with 9% of household income going towards energy bills, which is almost 3 times greater than non-low-income rural households. Some low-income households are even worse off. In some regions, 1/4 of low-income rural households have a median energy burden greater than 15%. There are systemic barriers to rural communities accessing energy efficiency programs through their energy utilities or other means. Due to the high poverty and limited employment opportunities, many rural Americans simply cannot afford to invest in energy efficiency investments. Due to these systemic barriers, rural and urban communities have come together in Oregon to advocate for a bipartisan sponsored bill to establish a Healthy Homes program to leverage federal funds to provide home energy efficiency retrofits and home repairs for rural communities, communities of color, and low-income communities. It brings me hope and excitement knowing that Oregonians growing up in rural communities will have greater protections from poor outdoor air quality, such as the type I grew up in. Ultimately, I envision my hometown of Houston, Illinois, having the resources to address energy burdens, climate change, and transition to clean energy programs. I envision small towns across the country having the opportunity to shape what their communities need with federal support through legislative funding. I envision regenerative agriculture owned by local community members in rejuvenating the land. I envision community programs that provide home upgrades to low-income families, particularly those facing very high energy burdens. No matter what party you support, it's clear that the United States is facing multiple overlapping crises. We need to invest in the American people by supporting the projects that they envision to help reduce carbon emissions, create living wage local jobs, and prepare communities for climate disasters. When we put rural communities, communities of color, and low-income communities at the center of our policies, we truly invest in the communities that have the greatest needs for resources. Oregonians have given federal legislators a blueprint to build locally administered clean energy funds through federal funding. By enacting the inevitable clean energy transition, we must build jobs and wealth in communities that have been excluded or harmed by the current economy. If we could take the opportunity to come together in creating real solutions, there will be plenty of shared ground to walk on towards realizing these shared goals. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand it over to Sean Sweeney, the coordinator of the trade unions for energy democracy, to talk about workers and public power.
Thank you, Anissa. I've set my timer for 6 minutes, so hopefully I'll stick to time. Thanks for asking me to be part of this presentation, this briefing. I want to thank Emerald Cities Collaborative and the Energy Democracy team here, and also Senator Merkley and other representatives who are participating in this event. In my work with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, it's a global project, so we take on the global experience of the energy transition. And there are a few sort of conclusions that have emerged from that, which I'd like to share with the audience here. And we've landed at a place we call energy democracy at all levels, which means the levels of the utilities and the governments, as well as communities. We're particularly heartened in the US with the House resolution that will be forthcoming from Representative Cori Bush, who's calling for reclaiming utilities, investor-owned utilities, to public ownership. And I want to say a word or two about that in a moment, but I think that is absolutely crucial if community energy and local control is to thrive in the future. If we look at the situation in other parts of the world, I mean, the development of renewable energy in Europe, which has gone faster than any other region really, has been based on subsidies of homeowners and farmers, what they call the feed-in tariff. The feed-in tariff led to a very fast deployment of renewable energy, but it wasn't very equitable. Non-homeowners, non-landowners were left out of the picture, but the costs of the tariff were passed on to working class people and communities of color and immigrants and so on. So this is quite a regressive situation. The community energy project had to fit in with that agenda. And it also led, on the other hand, to the disruption of the utilities, so much that they had falling market share, but rather than accept that fate, they passed those costs of the falling market share onto consumers in the form of higher retail costs. They called it things like system charges or administrative fees. Either way, they got their money. So we ended up with a system which had quite a high penetration of renewables, quite a lot of local energy production done by farmers and homeowners, but not too much by way of an equitable distribution, which is what we would like to change, I think, in the context of the US. So I think the approach we would like to see in some of the proposals is a partnership with community, municipalities, and utilities. Now, what would that mean? Well, first of all, and this is where I think Representative Bush's proposed resolution is on target, is it means that the utilities have to have a change of mandate. At the moment, like everybody else, they are rewarded for how much electricity they sell. And that is a problem on several levels. The first level, of course, is it means they oppose community energy. They find ways of avoiding it. They drag their feet. They're not interested because it cuts into their market share and their profits. Secondly, there are system-related disruptions that go along with this. It's not easy to run an electricity system. So the additional costs of balancing the grid come on the doorstep of the utilities. So the utilities should be relieved of that responsibility. If they were publicly owned, then the issue of how much electricity they sold would not be the primary concern. What would be the main concern was how they can partner with communities and municipalities on driving through a low carbon energy system and making that happen. They have a major role to play, but at the moment, the mandate shift that occurred in the 1980s and 90s with privatization has to be reversed. And as we do our work at the local level, I think it's hugely important that we keep an eye on the need to repeal some of those laws that were passed in the 80s and 90s that set the investor-owned utilities on their current path. This is already being considered in other countries. We see Mexico, for example, the government is moving to reclaim the public utility to full public ownership as a means of driving an energy transition. So the other aspect of involving the utilities, I think, and for creating jobs and wealth in local communities is an emphasis on conserving energy. The scientific consensus is that energy conservation must play a huge role if we're to reach climate targets. But that's not going to happen, again, with the commodified system we have, where the more electricity you sell, the more revenue you generate to return dividends to private investors. That has to stop. We are in a very good position to hire, in the same way as the original New Deal did, public works programs aimed at energy conservation. And that will do a lot to enhance community wealth and improve job possibilities for excluded communities. So the public works dimension of this is very much part of the energy democracy discussion. But at my amount of time now, I thank you for the opportunity. You've heard a lot about community power and public power. So I just want to, I'm sure you have a lot of questions, so I want to hand it back to Crystal and Denise to take us to the next part of the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean, and to all of our panelists today for laying out a framework for energy democracy. We heard a lot about the importance of community energy, of community-led and controlled energy systems. We heard about the importance of public power and the distribution of energy assets to communities to repair and reinvest in our communities and build community wealth towards a clean energy future. At this point in our agenda, we want to open it up to you and to the questions that you have. And there are a number of them, I think I see already in the Q&A section. And I see, Crystal, are you going to pose the questions?
Yeah, we do have some fewer questions. Do you want to engage those questions first before we?
Yes. Before
we get into the questions directly from the audience.
No, let's go ahead and deal with the audience questions.
Sure. So right here we have a question, a fun question about, Jonathan asked a question about, would incorporating an equity lens, for example, the energy democracy approach, affect the pace at which we're able to decarbonize the energy system?
So there's always yeah, you know, it's sort of the tension that we see, and I'm going to ask people in our panel to raise your hands to that question, but I'll open up by saying it is the typical way that we see the world in binaries, right? So it's either jobs versus the environment, or it's, you know, it's greenhouse gas reduction versus local ownership and participation. And what my sense of it is that there is the importance of understanding this work as being intersectional, that in fact, this is, as I think Senator Merkley suggested, an unprecedented opportunity to not only address climate change and carbon emission standards, but also to change our economy in a way that is going to be just and equitable to fix the legacy challenges of the old dirty energy system. So there is, there's an art to it, there's a science to it, there's an effort and a need to be collaborative with the multiple stakeholders that are involved in the energy ecosystem to create solutions that are in fact intersectional. So I do not see that. I see carbon versus community, a generative economy as being a false solution. But I open that up to other members of the panel who might want to speak to this.
I'd love to just take a quick statement on this. You know, I think the equity concern it's a real question. And it's something we see at the organizing level all the time. Do we have the time to do the right kind of slow cook organizing that we have to do in order to get to where we want to go? The thing about equity and the slow start of it is that it will catapult itself if you do it right at the beginning. You might misjudge the timing if you think it's going to be slow the whole way. The truth is if you set equity as a standard, as a base standard, as a starting point, what you'll get to is a very fast acceleration right around where, if you were to just go the regular way, the normal sort of top-down profit only way, you would stay at a particular pace, but equity allows you to catapult. So I just want to offer to Jonathan and all who have a question about that slow start, it will begin to boil and you'll get to catapult and solve lots of things at one time, because equity at the center of anything is going to bring in lots of systems and lots of solutions that actually start making positive impacts and ripple impacts across and down the road.
Denise, I see you nodding your head. Did you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about the history of the Portland Clean Energy Fund Coalition. And the way I would put it is that, sometimes you got to go slow to go fast. And so we took a couple years because there was a lot of rifts between the labor unions, the traditional environmental groups, and the BIPOC community organizations. And it took us some time to build some trust up. But once we had that trust, we ran with it. And ever since the Portland Clean Energy Fund has passed on the ballot measure, our movement has been accelerated. And I would just add that what equity does when you put it at the center is it brings the most voices to the table and it provides the most meaningful solutions. And so that getting everyone to the table takes a second, but it's worth the investment.
And there's also research that suggests that when communities own their own energy, that there is a greater sensibility, recognition, and commitment to energy conservation. And so it's going to be sort of that last mile solution, and what Sean even mentioned about the importance of conservation as being a part of the calculus. People don't own their energy usage if they're not really participating in a significant way in the energy economy. So I do have a question here, and I think it's going to be pointed at Timothy, which is, why do we not see more community ownership, community controlled solar nationwide? Why aren't we seeing more projects like this already that you're participating in?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I think some of it is, some of the things I mentioned about federal policy. We have an incentive structure at the federal level right now that provides a lot of these tax benefits for building solar, but you have to have a huge tax liability to do it, which is, if you're doing it at an individual scale, a homeowner or somebody who has a lot of capital. But for these larger community scale projects, that means you have to find a big investor. And they would much prefer a lot of the time to finance projects that they will own for 25 years, as opposed to partnering in a model that has community ownership. I think there's also just a lack of investment at a state and federal level in capacity building to equip communities to really develop projects in and for their communities. And that's another big thing that we need a much stronger focus on. For 100 years, we've had an energy system where people were told, you just sit back and pay your electric bill, don't bother about what goes on behind the scenes. And that means that most people in our communities have never had the opportunity to practice being involved in clean energy development at a community level. And so we need to rebuild that capacity as well as restructure our economic framework in a way that is inviting to communities to be a part of it.
So let me just probe a little bit further on that. So is there, what kind of investment, and are there resources and investments being made in building the capacity of communities to own their own energy and to build cooperatives?
Yeah, I mean, there's a growing effort. I mean, even at the Department of Energy, there's growing interest in this community ownership question in their community solar program. But there's also just a lot of grassroots efforts. I'm part of, and several other organizations are part of, a network called the People's Solar Energy Fund that is explicitly focused on that. How do we provide training and technical assistance for community-based groups to form energy cooperatives, to create local projects that are community owned? And then how do we pair that with financing that is non-extractive, that is really respecting the rights and the values of local communities to own and control projects together?
Right. I have two questions, and Crystal, I'll ask you to curate the others, but I'm going to throw one at Sean, which is very specific about public power. We've worked with a number of cities that have looked to municipalize their investor-owned utilities, and have done feasibility studies and found it to be more expensive or too expensive or not feasible. What does the federal government need to do to help towards the municipalization or to the creation of public power systems?
Thank you, Denise, for that question, and whoever in the audience might have raised something, that question or something similar. The federal government, to repeat what I said a few minutes ago, I think they need to, there needs to be an approach to the power sector that allows for a partnership to thrive between municipalities, communities, and utilities. And the reason why that's important is that most municipalities who are trying to decarbonize now are beginning to recognize that there's only a certain amount of electricity can be produced inside the boundaries of a city. And this was surprisingly neglected for many years. It was assumed, and this goes back to the Energiewende, the German version of the energy transition. It was assumed by the pioneers of that movement that because there was so much wind and sun, if everybody had a solar panel or a wind turbine close by, they would generate enough electricity. That is not the case. If we look at energy consumption in cities, even if every roof had a solar panel and every field around the city had a windmill, it wouldn't generate enough power based on current levels of consumption, which is where energy conservation comes in. So one way or another, we're going to have to partner with utilities because municipalities are already signing long-term power contracts with private renewable energy companies. And big corporations like Google and Amazon are doing the same. So if we want to stop a new system of oligopoly coming in with energy, and this time it will be large renewable energy companies with corporations, we have to have the federal government has to make sure there's a mandate shift at the level of the utilities so they go back to serving the public good. They are very democratic and transparent, and they are not remunerated on the basis of selling volumes of electricity. It needs to be conservation and performance need to be part of that. Now, this sounds a very alien discussion because it's been a long time since public ownership of energy was even considered politically feasible. But I think we've turned that corner, so we have to wrestle with these different types of system level concepts which can help us reach decarbonization goals, job creation, and community and involvement and influence. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Crystal, did you have another question? Because I see one here about the tensions between labor and community control.
I have a lot of questions, but if you want to get into that conversation, we could too.
All right, so we have a bit of time. So this is a bit of a long question. See, I'm interested in the tension that arises in this important cross-sectoral, intersectional work. And that is the tension between unionized labor aiming to ensure living wage jobs and frontline communities aiming to ensure that renewable energy projects bring maximum benefits to low-income BIPOC residents, ensuring pathways to ownership. The question is, what do we do about these tensions? These are important to lift up to promote conversations across differences to figure out win-win solutions. See, is there
Yeah, this is Colette. Sean, I don't know if you wanted to go in on that. I wanted to just speak about the Gulf South, not necessarily unionized workers, which we should have a conversation about the ability to unionize in the South and what that can look like. But even non-union workers who are in the oil and gas industry, you know, the tension exists, and we work in a lot of Black communities, a lot of Native communities, and our uncles and our brothers and some of our sisters are on those rigs. And they're very nervous because the conversation is really about the end of their job, with no one really talking about what their future holds. And that is where organizing really has to come in. And I think this is where we've missed the mark a lot because the work of organizing oftentimes is invisible, and you don't really know that you need it until you needed it 2 years ago. So as we talk about this energy transition, especially in the Gulf, especially in oil and gas, the work has been to allow people in the industry to understand the impacts of the industry on their livelihood. It's not for me to tell somebody what the impacts are. It's for folks to be able to see and connect their own dots and make their own determination of what's going on. In the red block South where I live, there is no counter narrative. There is no other side of the story. There is no other side of the rainbow, or even the ability, and I would say the education and space and privilege to imagine what a new energy future could look like. That's how strong the oil and gas hole is on our region. But that industry was losing jobs pre-COVID. The writing is on the wall for oil and gas, and some people are starting to see it, if not because of the jobs that were being lost pre-COVID, because of the land that's being lost now, because of sea level rise, because of the pollution that's happening right now, because of increased refining and use of plastics and things that come from this same industry. I would say the work is, the tensions are there. So let's make no bones about that. The tensions are there. The work here is to organize folks to see their impact, their own power, their own self-determination, and their own ability to chart their own future. They may or may not be in the next phase of the energy future. They may choose to do something else. This means we have to start having conversations about labor, not about jobs, about labor, about what that means. What are people really looking for? Is it that everybody really wants a job, or is it that everybody wants basic needs covered? Because what would our society look like if we start having different kinds of conversations? This is organizing work. It's long-term work, it's real. And I think we've got to start with those folks who are going to be in the transition so that they can feel like even if they have to shift, they have their own power and determination around that shift.
Thank you, Colette. Crystal, turn it over to you.
Yes, and that was a perfect transition from Colette was saying. Al here was asking, since we were talking about organizing being really important, Al has a question about the work to democratize energy and center equity is organizing work. So how can federal legislation fund the local organizing work and leadership development needed for our communities to take control of our energy resources? Open to any panelist speakers.
Jessica, you want to take that?
Sure, very briefly, I just want to emphasize our communities really hold a lot of the solutions to these problems that we're talking about today, but we don't have the resources to really implement all the ideas that come from our communities. So certainly finding ways to actually fund our community organizing is very important so that we can build those relationships with the different sectors in our communities, including with labor. We need to have those conversations and come together with these solutions. And so certainly, and specifically in the work that I do is centered around community choice energy policy, or also known as community choice aggregation. And one thing that I think is really unique about the aggregation piece is that this is where we could actually begin to pull together small, medium-sized, and large solar installations to make them eligible for project labor agreements so that this work can be unionized and scaled up at the same time. So we have these ideas. We need help in implementing them. We need the resources to be able to organize and have these conversations with every intersection of our communities, because at the end of the day, we want to see our young people, the next generation in this workforce, trained and have full-time family-sustaining unionized work.
Thank you for that, Jessica. And I would just want to add, in sort of leveraging and riffing off of Sean, Colette, and Jessica's comments about, the importance of investing in communities, but also the multi-stakeholder engagement. If we're going to shift an entire sector of the economy, one of the largest sectors of the economy, we do have to do the work of the Emerald Cities, for example, which is sitting down with labor and youth organizations and community advocates and mainstream green groups to do business differently. I mean, that's the end of the day. And there are so many systemic barriers that get in the way for us, that embrace unions, for example, that get in the way for us to be a part of the union family. So, and our goals may be close, but not completely aligned. So it's only through those conversations, through trust building, and through strategic sort of seeing ourselves with a common fate and a common strategy, that we're really going to make the kind of shift that's going to be necessary, where there are, in fact, win-win solutions.
federal government has the opportunity to help us out with education and awareness, which must come before organizing. In Kentucky, it takes tens of thousands of dollars to engage with the PSC in a rate case. There are no mechanisms for the public to learn about the intricacies of the decisions that are being made on their behalf. And the last few rate cases that we intervened in have cost us upwards of $30,000, and we've engaged citizen experts who come to the table to read hundreds of pages of legal filings. And it's very difficult to interpret and translate those filings to the public. And there are models of engagement across the country that the federal government could lift up, in which they ask utilities to fund the engagement needs of the public. And they have citizen utility boards and others. So those are a couple more examples of how the government can help us to get to where we need to be to begin that organizing.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I want to remind our video guests that we do have a full policy framework that really identifies some of these issues, and specifically, as Chris was referring to and Subin raised up in his comments about intervenor funds. The changes that are going to take place will require a massive amount of numbers of regulatory proceedings at the FERC level and at the local level. And as citizens, and even as Kim talks about as a citizen scientist, we don't have the time, we don't have the money, we don't have necessarily the legal advice to be an effective partner in those regulatory proceedings. And so our communities need to be funded to be a part of those regulatory conversations and decisions. Crystal, how are we on questions? Do we have others?
Yeah, we do have others. I wanted to make sure we have every comments about organizing before I move away from the organizing question.
I have one more thing to add. So yesterday, a coal miners union indicated that it will accept a switch to renewable energy in exchange for jobs. And one of the main things that they are really uplifting is that they need investment. They need investment, and it completely goes into this community organizing of how we, in this push for energy democracy, how we are inclusive to everybody. And that's a huge part in us, having conversations together. And, we always end up dealing, we always think it's separate, but really we really are on the same path, and we need to remember that, to be inclusive, and that we need each other moving forward.
Thank you for that. So, Anissa, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. I just have one final thought. When you're designing policies and programs, I would encourage you all to think about how you can include things like grant committees, citizens utility boards, and how you can set up those structures to represent the communities who are most impacted. So for example, in the Portland Clean Energy Fund Grant Committee, we have a requirement for folks to be representative of the communities that are most impacted by climate change in the city of Portland. So 90% of the committee is BIPOC, 80% are low income, and 30% live on the east side of Portland, where pollution is highest. So that's an example of how you can structure a program to build leadership. Thank you.
Right, and she's exactly right. If we're also talking about workers, we need to talk about the communities that are directly impacted. What are the health impacts? What, not only to people, the land and the air and the water, but also people's bodies. We can't talk about what a just transition looks like without really thinking about how we honor health and how we honor Earth.
So I'd like to change the conversation to the opposite end. We're talking about real solutions with community organizing, but a lot of times when we're talking about climate solutions, it seems to be on the other side of it, which is really a lot of what we call false climate solutions. We have two sets of questions related to false climate solutions. Really wanted to speak on, see if there's any speakers who could really talk about the importance of rejecting the quote false climate solutions and some of the energy democracy alternatives here. And also, if relatedly, if we could get Congress to pass a steadily rising fee on fossil fuels coupled with dividends to all citizens, how do you feel about that? Does that help energy democracy? looping that all into false climate solutions. Jessica.
Yes, I feel compelled to answer this because I spent over a year fighting nuclear energy in our local community choice program, which was really being pitched as carbon-free energy. But first of all, our environmental justice communities know that nuclear energy is actually really bad for communities. It's bad in the mining process, transport, and also in dumping. It never goes away. It persists for generations, and it affects communities' health and as well as frontline workers, right? And so just to really emphasize that it's dangerous, and here in California, we're trying to move away completely from nuclear energy, and taking nuclear energy actually would displace true clean energy jobs and infrastructure that we're advocating for. So we must actually also fight these false solutions to climate change, because that is not part of the clean energy future that our communities are dreaming of. Thanks.
I just wanted to amplify what Jessica was saying, like false solutions, whether it's, you know, nuclear or trash burning, or I mean, some people are even talking about natural gas as still a part of the picture. You know, they all have problems in their own right. You know, they all have reasons why they're just hurtful to our communities, but they're also taking up space. They're taking up space from the conversation when we could be moving towards the things that we actually need to see. And I think that's a really important thing to note, that whenever we make an infrastructure decision that's going to last for 20 to 40 years, we're not making an infrastructure decision to build the types of just and community-based solutions we want to see. And that's the way we need to be thinking about that choice at every point. I also briefly wanted to touch on the second piece of that question about the raising fees on fossil fuels and redistributing that. I think that's a really good idea. I think we also need to look at how does that redistribution create investment opportunities in our communities that are disproportionately benefiting the people who have been most impacted. I think we can't just expect that like a per capita distribution is going to magically solve the problem. We have to kind of strategically target that to where it's most needed.
Sean?
Sorry, who's?
Do you want to respond, Sean?
Oh, I was actually going to come in at the risk of being a little bit controversial here. I actually think it's not a good move to close down nuclear until there is something different. And I wouldn't rule out nuclear being part of a low carbon solution or low carbon energy system. And I know that's controversial, but I think to call it a full solution when we also have to deal with the fact that large scale deployment of renewables, it takes up a lot of space. It takes up a lot of, there's a lot of minerals and metals. There's a lot of mining going on in terms of renewables. It's not a benign form of energy. Nothing in the energy system that we know today is benign. So everything has its implications. And I would urge us as a group, as we talk about energy democracy, to think about what it means to be 100% renewable energy in terms of the spatial concerns that are involved. I'll just use a story. You know, the indigenous groups in Oaxaca oppose wind energy, and the story was generated in the north, the global north, that they opposed it because they didn't get sufficient compensation for their loss of land. Is carbon pricing. I don't think that's a good solution, not just because it allows people to make money and there's speculation involved, is because it doesn't reduce emissions or pollution. The evidence shows that what companies do is they basically pass the charge down on to end users. So a $10 polluter's fee or $10 per ton for carbon dioxide or $20 doesn't change anybody's behavior. It just gets passed down, and the worst of both possible worlds for workers comes out. And that is, We pay for the pollution in the form of the price, and we end up with the carbon dioxide and the pollution in the atmosphere anyway, because it's not changing behavior at all. So aside from the fact that it's political suicide, and the last point I would make on this, if you don't mind, is that it's easily defeated in ballot initiatives. It's lost in nearly every example so far. And the other thing that needs to be said about it in terms of the labor discussion and how we want to involve labor unions, President Obama wanted an economy-wide cap and trade, basically an emissions trading system modeled on the European emissions trading system. It was defeated. Labor opposed the carbon price, not because they're against dealing with climate change, not because they're against community energy. They opposed it because they knew the carbon price would result in an acceleration of the demise of coal and the rise in the use of gas for power generation. That was one of the main reasons. They also knew that there was no job prospects in renewables when 90% of solar PV is imported into the United States. And the same is true of the main components in wind turbines, such as the generators and the blades. All of the offshore wind will be done by overseas-based companies. So we've got to deal with that problem first before we start slapping carbon prices that are not effective and they get passed on to the end users, which are normally working class people, communities of color, and so on. And then I think that would be that's a full solution and one we should guard against. And I know many people in the climate justice and energy democracy movement are aware of the things I've said. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I wanted to jump in just to add that one thing I noticed about this conversation, and I agree, it's very controversial to talk about nuclear. One thing I noticed about this conversation is sometimes what's ignored is how it's possible to ethically mine materials, but it is not possible to ethically store nuclear. Unfortunately, the risk, the human risk, the environmental risk of nuclear is so high that I don't really agree with the argument that they're comparable fully. I think there's a great organization called IRMA that does great work advocating with companies. I can put it in the chat to have ethical mining resources. And so I would say this is a nuanced conversation, but it requires some thoughts about like how do we make our systems more ethical, and how do we use solutions that we know are not going to actively harm communities, and what can we do to make the systems more accessible. And I'll pass it off to Subin because I see your hands up.
Sure, I'll be brief. I just wanted to relate and shift the conversation in some ways to lift up why we have to focus on harms and benefits. If we just plainly, for example, to go back to the clean energy or clean electricity standard, if we have nothing but that as what we type into the GPS, who knows where we're going to get. And that's not answering, that's not me diving into this conversation, but it's to say, we need at a minimum to prioritize energy sources based on its impact on people on the planet. Like that shouldn't be controversial. And we need at least that. And at the same time, we need to recognize that different approaches to energy have different benefits. So if we combine these things, I think that will have a powerful impact on actually driving down harmful sources of energy generation and driving up not just the type of generation, but also but the method in which the generation is done, who owns it, and all the details that we really try to focus here on why community leadership and ownership and control of distributed resources is really what we're trying to center in this conversation.
The only thing I would add is that when we talk about democratizing the energy sector, I think the core element is really how we engage communities in the decision-making and in the process. And we often find solutions that are coming from industry, from labor, from corporations that do not engage, neither transparent nor do they effectively engage communities in the problem solving. And so that can't happen. That is, I think, a core requirement that we're in true and honest, tough conversations about how we make this energy transition and shift.
Yeah.
We do have maybe five minutes. I know that we really said 2 hours, but we said 90 minutes. And so, but I do want to get in as many of the questions that we can answer in the course of the next few maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm grouping questions here, and a lot of the questions really about how we make this happen, because it seems like a lot of the audience is actually not just from the Congress and the staffer, but really our allies, and really what we're saying is really resonating with them. And now, how do we actually get these things to the table? How do we actually get the regions and the states who are not really agreeing with these priorities to actually act, to do something? I think we could get into that question if that's what we're feeling like, or we can get into a closing comment and statement from each of the speakers. Denise, what do you think we should do here?
Well, I think it's a very important question, because I think there's 2 levels of work that's required. We're here and talking to our congressional friends and allies, because whatever investments that are going to be made around climate, we need to establish the standards, procedures, allocations at the federal level, but ultimately it will go to states and local communities, right? These dollars will go to state governments, it will go to local governments. And so there's going to be the groundwork of communities making certain that that these investments are actually going to be democratizing our energy sector as much as possible. So whatever we can do at the national level to make this legislation come correct, so I can use that language, will help in the local work that needs to take place. But there is no getting away from the fact that each and every one of us needs to be fully engaged with our local utilities, with our state governments, with our local PUCs, the Public Service Commission, to advocate and to organize and to move policies in a way that really speaks to community engagement, transparency, community energy, and public power. That's just my sense of what the work is, which is number one, educating yourself. And let me make a plug for the Energy Democracy Project, which is an entity of networks, 40 networks and organizations that are doing this work, that's gone through the good, the bad, the ugly, and the pain of all this, that have the specialized expertise and knowledge about how to, and see ourselves as being a resource to others that are trying to do this work around the country. So we will be, I think, making our website or contact information available for you to help you with any specific questions or issues that you might have to work in your particular communities. Any other comments from our panelists about how do you do this? We heard about educating. We heard about organizing. We heard about changing, tax credits and investment resources. We heard about capacity building. What are some of the other ideas that you might want to offer as we close out?
I would start with asking the folks that are impacted the most by the current systems. Those are the people that know what they need. Nobody knows their community better than the people who live there. And so, if you want to know about how to do workforce development with equity, go look at Los Angeles. If you want to learn about how to do site-specific investments for energy efficiency, you can go to Ouachita Electric in Arkansas and see how they actually invested in their owner members and led to a 4.5% rate decrease, the kind of rate decrease that all Americans would love to see in their communities. And so ask Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities, and we have the answers, and we have the solutions, and we're ready to teach everyone else how to scale them up.
I'll jived up now. Yeah, I would add that for me, relationship building is really the center of my organizing work. And I would say whatever you can do to make your organizing less transactional, more based on relationships and trust is really the core and the foundation of a good organizing. And then I would also add that, just being open to new ideas. I mean, the Portland Clean Energy Fund was not an idea that I think really was thought about before 2016, at least not in our region. And so I think, really being open to the ideas that are coming from community, and even if they seem kind of wild and new, and you think, well, we can't take down those billion-dollar corporations. We don't know until we try. So we need to try. The future of our planet and many of our communities in the present is at stake, and we need to do our best. Thanks.
I'll go if that's okay. Yeah, I just want to really remind folks that really the main reason why we're doing a lot of this work is for future generations. I've inherited a lot of health disparities, land desecration, and really thinking about what's it going to be like in 5 years, 20 years, 50 years. When I was young and thinking about that, it seemed like it was so far away, but really it's what we do now that our young folks are going to be inheriting it. And we have this really unique opportunity because we know what we've done wrong, we know what we need to change, and we know what direction we need to go in, and we know what the barriers are to that. So we really do have to come together and figure out, how we are really going to continue to honor the earth, honor each other, and within that, honor the health.
Thank you for that. So we want to, first of all, give everyone an opportunity to have some parting comments and show our true appreciation for all of you that have been a part of today's briefing, to hear what we think is probably the most important piece of work around climate change right now. And I apologize for all the other questions we didn't get to, like energy efficiency is a part of our platform. Please make sure you get a copy of our energy democracy policy framework, which goes into more detail about what we care about and how these things fit together. But I'm excited. I personally want to say that this is an historic moment in time where everyone understands the importance of climate. They understands the importance of energy transition that relates to the need for economic recovery, democracy, and equity. But we've got to get it right. If we are just nibbling around the edges and just going to reform a little bit and sprinkle a few jobs here and keep the corporate energy system in place, we're going to miss the opportunity to make a radical shift in a world that's worth living in, and fixing the legacy of environmental, social, and economic injustice. We can't blow this. It'll be another 100 years. Someone said 20 years. It'll be another 100 years before this chance ever comes around again, if it comes around again. So I'm encouraging our congressional leaders to reach out to us and to work with us as you shape up legislation that will make a difference in the lives of communities that have been historically neglected and abused, and to our entire network of amazing people, amazing practitioners who bring specialized, legal knowledge and financial knowledge and organizing knowledge to this effort. Any other closing comments, please, from our panelists?
I just wanted to highlight that a lot of the time we talk about, it's so difficult to do these things because of the way things are. I just wanted to really emphasize that the way things are right now is a set of rights that political decisions and economic decisions have set as to who wins, who loses, and who decides. And we can make different choices. And there are ways to do this so much better than we do it right now. We can do it cheaper, cleaner, healthier, create more local benefits. So many of us on this call have experience with doing that in our small scales, and we can do that in a big scale if we work together.
Right. Well, if there are no other closing comments, I want to thank everyone again for coming out to our congressional briefing today. Again, thanking Senator Merkley and Representative Nanette Barragan for being our guest and hosting this conversation. And let it just be the beginning of many more planning and strategic thinking and the work that we have to do. Thank you all.
We will follow up with an email, and the contact information will also be in that email. Thank you all so much. And we look forward to building with you all and connecting the money from the federal level all the way to the actual work happening in the communities, investing into people power.
All right.
Thank you all.